Hi there, folks. My name is Josh Buck. I'm the Executive Director Curator of the Clark Historical Museum here in Old Town, Eureka. I'd like to welcome you to our latest round of our Saturday Speaker Series, which is brought to you in part by the Humboldt County Historical Society, the Humboldt County Library, and the Clark Museum. I'd also like to thank our fiscal sponsors, Carl Johnson Company and the Cutting Edge Hair Salon. Without their support, the series would not be possible. As usual, I'd also like to thank our man behind the camera, Jay Tillman, for his outstanding live stream services. Today's speaker is Patrick O'Rourke. Patrick brings a unique perspective, blending his formal training in cultural history, focused on the Soviet Union and post-war United States. With his hands-on experience in archaeology and cultural resource management, Patrick supervises the identification, cataloging, and interpretation of historic artifacts at the Cultural Resources Facility, conducts field surveys across Northern California, and mentors undergraduate students. This presentation stems from Patrick's work with a collection of historic logging equipment at Fort Humboldt Historic State Park in Eureka. This project deepened his passion for local logging history and lore. Welcome, Patrick. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Very good to be here. Thanks, Josh. All right, hi. Thanks for joining me on my talk. This is my presentation, Cutting Their Teeth, Saws, Skill, Labor, and Environment in the Humboldt Bay Redwoods. So, as Josh just mentioned, this project stems from some work I did as a collaboration with California State Parks and the Cal Poly Humboldt Cultural Resources Facility. This was a cataloging of over 1,500 objects at Fort Humboldt State Park. This included saws, saw filing equipment, yarding systems, personal effects, really impressive collection that I'm really glad I get to share with you today. When I first started cataloging this collection, I really had no formal knowledge of logging history or really local history at that point. So I hit the books. I started spending a lot of time in the Humboldt room at the Humboldt County Library and brushing up on academic histories and then local histories. And when that still wasn't enough to really know what I was looking at, I started collecting PDFs of vintage equipment catalogs and started reading forestry textbooks. And through all that, I've accumulated a body of research that I get to present with you today. So that's essentially my personal entry point. I would say more historical entry point, we're going to talk briefly about the history of the American logging industry. So the American logging industry begins in Maine in the early 1600s as a colonial endeavor. It is largely ephemeral logging activity for farmer loggers who are just clearing pastures for agricultural purposes. But evolves into a commercial industry by about the 1640s as commissioned for commissioning lumber for purposes of shipbuilding for the Royal Navy. They're practicing clear cutting and gradually moving westward into the rest of New England or New York. By the 1700s, the logging frontier would expand to the Lake States as well as the southern and mid-Atlantic. These frontiers would be used to fuel construction developments for westward expansion. And as westward expansion continues, we eventually wind up in the Pacific Northwest with the logging frontier beginning in British Columbia by around 1820. And then logging gradually makes its way south to the point that we make our way to Humboldt Bay region in about 1850. The Humboldt Bay region would be a broader part of a larger logging frontier called Redwood Country, as coined by the first historian of Redwood Country, Charles Goodwin Noyes. This lumber from this frontier would be used largely to construct the San Francisco Bay Area as well as Southern California, but would also be used as an export market for the United States, with old growth redwood becoming a very popular commodity in Asia as well as Australia. Uh, and so the point of where our story begins here, roughly 1850, where we're at as a country to talk about personal entry point and where the logging industry is headed, is that we've built a coast-to-coast nation. We have a strong export economy. We have a growing population. So the problem that we're facing at this time is how do we sustain what we've already built? How do we continue to grow? And how do we accomplish this cooperatively? So essentially the two things that we do need for the logging industry going forward are going to be a stable system of labor relations and a sound environmental policy. And the quest for those two things will guide the evolution of the logging industry over the period we're talking about, which is roughly 1850 to 1960 today. And what I'm doing here in terms of how my research at Fort Humboldt relates to this is trying to understand the evolution of the saw over time and how that collection relates to those ideas about solving these dilemmas, in the sense that there are a series of formal and informal debates that pop up surrounding labor relations and environmental policy, and how the saw evolved to provide solutions to those debates, and how technology maybe influenced the outcomes of those debates. And through looking at that, I found a story of how really the role of the tree feller, which begins as a very position of unskilled labor, gains acclaim over years and becomes a more sophisticated position with more legal protections. So let's start our journey. And we begin in what's called the pre-industrial era. So logging industry begins in the Humboldt Bay region generally to acquire the necessary raw materials for the booming gold rush of the 1850s. Logging began as more of a secondary industry to the county. It was secondary to agriculture. However, both agriculture and logging during this time were seasonal endeavors that shut down during the winter. Consequently, the majority of the population of Humboldt County during this time would be transient labor. Of those recorded on the original 1850 census, only about a third of those would be remaining in the county by 1860. The laborers during this time, around 1850, were predominantly white Americans and Northern Europeans that migrated from New England from a former logging frontier, bringing with them that experience. This sort of chain migration is pretty significant because really to survive in the Humboldt Bay region, you had to have social connections for things like housing and finding work. And in the case of being a tree faller, you had to have someone you could rely on in the forest, because this wasn't a one-person job. You had to have someone that could show up and make sure the job gets done, because if you don't have that kind of output, you're not necessarily going to get a paycheck. And this sort of system of social relations and sort of social organization at this time can be broadly understood as proprietary capitalism. And proprietary capitalism is a very large concept that can essentially be broken down to a system where there's an individual at the head of a labor hierarchy. This is associated with a system of labor relations referred to as paternalism. Paternalism is a system where the sort of employer's benevolence is really emphasized, and there's sort of a kinship tie between employer and employee. Paternalism is a pretty complex issue for the historical record because it's been interpreted very differently across different examples. There are examples of paternalism locally, such as the Elk River Mill at Falk, at the company town of Falk, that have been remembered with great nostalgia for sort of a time lost of a simpler time. There are also figures such as labor historian of the 1970s, Eugene Genovese, that have been very critical of paternalism on the context of basis of saying things like, well, workers lacked the education to understand the depths of their exploitation, so there wasn't really a working class consciousness. The argument against this case in the context of the Humboldt Bay region would be that these workers were emerging more in a democratic Republican context and not really a Marxist context. So the idea of a broad system of class-based oppression wouldn't be something that's part of the popular ethos at this time. This isn't to say that workers couldn't be critical of capitalism. It was more so that their critiques would generally be placed at certain individuals within that system, i.e. like sort of the robber barons of the muckraker press of the Gilded Age. But conversely, the big industrialists of the Humboldt Bay region, as I pictured here, such as Isaac Miner or John Vance, had very rags to riches stories and came from very humble origins. And consequently, many of those laborers in the Humboldt Bay region felt a sort of mutual pioneer struggle between them and possibly believed that this was a possible future through their hard work and determination. And there was not necessarily the alienation from their labor. As far as work hierarchy during this time, there were positions that were skilled and educated. If you worked in the sawmill as a sawyer, you had to have some degree of mathematical knowledge to be able to make the proper cuts. However, working in the forest was generally work for people who couldn't find work elsewhere. This was a very rough and tough life. That's not to say that there weren't skilled positions. Probably the most prestigious position you could have in the forest during this time was that of the bullwhacker. The bullwhacker was tasked with skidding logs using teams of about 6 to 8 yokes of oxen. The sort of skill in question would be the personality of the bullwhacker, because the bullwhacker is remembered for sort of the nasty way that they spit and curse at these animals to sort of command them to move faster. So it's really, and lumber employers would actually go to great extent to sort of retain certain bullwhackers after the logging season was over, especially if they were effective at their job. So there was a degree of job security for them. Conversely, tree fallers at this time would be referred to as choppers in Redwood country. And choppers were generally whoever was around and willing to do the work because it was a very easily trainable skill. Choppers during this time, it was really a matter of patience and determination and strength to be able to do this, because to fell an old growth redwood, they were felling exclusively by axe at this point, and it could take a week, 2 weeks plural of 12-hour days to fell an old growth redwood because of depending on their size. And they really wouldn't, just typically they would move from logging camp to logging camp wherever work was available as the logging season ended. But speaking of the tools that they used, there were several tools that were adapted to the size of old growth redwoods. For the case of the Humboldt, for the case of redwood country, and to make felling these old growth giants more efficient. The most famous, as I just talked about, was the double-bitted felling axe. In the previous logging frontier of the Lake States, they were using only a single-bitted axe. The advantage of the double-bitted axe was that you had a second edge to cut because since loggers were spending a longer time in the forest, lumber employers didn't want their choppers returning to camps to sharpen their axe. So essentially, once one edge became dull, they could turn it around and just use the other edge. A sort of fact on top of that fact would be that actually most choppers knew better than to sharpen their axe all the way, because actually the number one injury in the forest at this point was actually choppers cutting their arm open on a too sharp axe. But these would have a handle that's longer than a typical felling axe, around 42 inches, which is around 10 inches longer. Typical felling axe, which delivered a wider swing to deliver a heavier blow, which required a heavier head that weighed commonly at least 4 pounds. Similarly, there was also the notion that the base of redwood trees would be too thick to cut through. Choppers referred to it as the butt swell. So they would build a sort of scaffolding built into the tree to cut a less dense higher portion of the tree. They would cut notches into the base of the tree and stick these long wooden posts with a metal shoe at the end called drivers. And they would either stand on a single driver or they would mount pairs of drivers and lay planks of wood across them called springboards and stand on them to cut that higher, less dense portion of the tree. And this would remain in practice until power saws would really take off and gain enough utility to be useful to cut through the butts well, and that wouldn't be until the 1950s or 1960s. Also, felling wedges of the redwoods are considerably larger. A typical modern felling wedge is around 8 to 12 inches long. The average length of a felling wedge in the Fort Humboldt collection is around 25 inches, and these are also made of solid steel. While a modern felling wedge is typically plastic or steel alloy, this is because solid steel would wind up becoming too harsh for cutting chains on chainsaws, but would work well in the days of crosscut saws and axes. And speaking of saws, there are saws around in the early pre-industrial era, but they're not used for felling at this point. They'd actually just be used for bucking, which is after a tree has fallen, separating the trunk into smaller logs. The most popular state-of-the-art saw at this point was being produced by E.C. Atkins and Company out of Indianapolis, called the Tuttle saw, named for J.H. Tuttle. This just had cutter teeth that were sort of curved. The technology here was about the same as, say, taking a nail and scratching at a piece of wood. It was making very shallow cuts. And it had gaps to allow the shavings to sort of escape out of the sides, but it's really less shavings at this point and really just sawdust. But the point of that allowing them to escape was that the number one flaw of these early saws was that they would get stuck in the kerf of the cut. Those using the saw would have certain solutions to this problem, such as lubricating the saw with kerosene. And I should mention, there is actually the first recorded use of felling with saws was actually with the harvesting of redwood timber for the construction of Fort Humboldt near the pioneer town of Bucksport in the 1850s. However, according to Colonel Robert C. Buchanan, very little work was done with whipsaws, as there was not a single man of the command who knew how to use them. To quell the confusion and frustration surrounding crosscut saws, these crosscut saw manufacturers, including E.C. Atkins or Simmons Manufacturing or Hindley Diston & Sons, employed crosscut demonstrators who traveled from logging camp to train saw filers and choppers to ensure the effectiveness of their product, which became a prestigious position in Humboldt County, and they would earn significantly more than choppers or in the woods or common hands in the yard. The tools for saw filing, as the saws were generally produced out of the Midwest at this point by the same companies that were making the saws, but we do start to see some tool manufacturers pop up locally, such as E. Jansen and Company based out of Eureka in the 1880s and 1890s. We have a sawtooth gauge used for setting crosscut saw teeth in our collection. As we see the expansion of the redwood logging industry and the logging industry of the Pacific Northwest, we do start to see a lot more manufacturers locally. But then let's go into the industrial era. So the 1870s to the turn of the century would see a dramatic acceleration in the scale and pace of the redwood lumber industry. In 1880, there were only 570 men employed in the Humboldt County lumber industry, but this number exceeded 1,000 by 1884. The sprawl of the logging industry was generally facilitated by an influx of Eastern capital, who was enabled to acquire vast timberlands by the Timber and Stone Act of 1878, Through fraud, wealthy East Coast investors manipulated the Timber and Stone Act to purchase massive tracts of land at $2.50 an acre that was supposed to go to settlers. This has most notoriously included the Scottish syndicate that formed the California Redwood Company that would be forcibly dissolved in the 1890s. However, after it was revealed the scale and extent that they exploited the law, however, most of their lands would actually just go into the hands of other large corporate lumber manufacturers at the time, such as the group known as the Buffalo Syndicate, which evolved into the Pacific Lumber Company that was incorporated in 1869, which would dominate redwood country through the 20th century. Following year, 1879, the formation of the Humboldt Lumber Manufacturers Association, which would be formed to signaling the introduction of corporate capitalism into the redwoods as a sort of now rival to the aforementioned proprietary capitalism. While the sort of management systems associated with corporate capitalism would continue to evolve, they would practice a sort of offshoot of paternalism, referred to as a sort of corporate paternalism. The main distinction here would be that it's no longer an individual at the head of a labor hierarchy, but rather sort of a kinship of salaried professionals or salaried executives. And also the management systems are generally no longer local. During this time, most of these larger corporate entities are headquarters in big cities of California, and most commonly for Humboldt Bay region would be San Francisco. This is so they can be on the ground of where the bigger business dealings are happening, or looking at scientific principles of efficiency, be close to universities. And these two systems would experience a great deal of friction, and this friction would really make the redwood country a contested landscape over the course of this period. And then in addition to that, this period will also see the industrialization of the logging industry, including not limited to the arrival of the steam locomotive in the 1870s, the invention of Dolbear's steam donkey in 1881, and the introduction of high-lead logging in the region by 1906. These inventions replaced the animal logging of the pre-industrial age and led to a reorganization of the workforce. The bullwhacker of yore was replaced by a zugler, who operated the donkey and with his hierarchy of yarding associates. Additionally, these inventions led to a broader regional sprawl of the logging industry, bringing operations deeper inland away from the bay and its sloughs. Additionally, interestingly, 1878, the same year as the Timber and Stone Act, is the same year that E.C. Atkins and Co. Acquired Robert E. Poindexter's patent for an improvement in saws that featured a saw pattern of 3 cutter teeth followed by a gullet, followed by a raker tooth. This saw functioned similarly to the Tuttle by the cutter teeth putting pressure on the wood and applying friction, and then following through with the raker teeth that would function like the blade of a hand plane and essentially making a deeper cut into the kerf and making a larger shaving and being able to escape through the gullet, preventing the sort of being caught in the kerf of previous saws. This would be instantly popular, partly because this invention would make felling by saw suddenly efficient possibility. It should be mentioned that also 1878 is the same year that these companies start manufacturing saws long enough for old growth redwoods that are often 12 feet and longer. But this would take off to the point that E.C. Atkins and Company would be manufacturing 3 major saw patterns by the 1890s. The diamond tooth, the concave tooth dexter, and a modified version of the Tuttle tooth that now features raker teeth, and all of which would feature raker teeth. And in addition to allowing saws to be used for felling redwood trees, this actually really limited the amount of time that it took to fell a tree. As I mentioned previously, felling by axe could take a week, 2 weeks, depending on the size of the tree. This reduced that task to a few 12-hour days. And it should be mentioned that also during this period, there is incremental increases in sort of the status of tree fellers during this time. One notable sort of trend is the emergence of collective bargaining movements in the region, which is a part of a nationwide trend over the malaise over Gilded Age capitalism. Multiple unions held brief existence in Humboldt County over the 1880s. These included the California Working Men's Party, which has lasted from about 1878 to 1880, the Greenback Labor Party, which lasted from 1880 to 1882, then the Knights of Labor that emerged probably mid-1880s and then disintegrated by the end of the decade. All three generally concerned themselves with self-improvement schemes via temperance, and a good amount of their efforts went towards eliminating Chinese and Japanese workers from the lumber industry. Transience of labor and persistent economic downturns would undermine the effectiveness of union movements during this time, and which is why they were so short-lasting. But a sort of main takeaway is that there is a sort of broadening trend that people in the lumber industry are starting to say that they have skilled labor that could be protected. And that is something that was not happening before this broad expansion and change in the lumber industry. But certainly on the part of lumber employers, the sort of position of saw feller, chopper is still viewed as unskilled labor, despite the techniques to do so have changed. It's still generally viewed as easily trainable. But there is an interesting development on the part of lumber employers, which is the advent of the company town. During the 1880s, we see the emergence of company towns in the Humboldt Redwoods, specifically Pacific Lumber Company's Scotia and Elk River Lumber Company's Falk. Company towns emerged during this period because, one, many lumber companies managed to secure vast acreages of timberlands in the immediate vicinity of their mills, which helped minimize the transitory nature of their operations. Second, there had been an improvement to railroad networks. And third, lumber companies were operating on a large enough scale and possessed sufficient capital to establish these company towns. But what's interesting about these company towns is that there certainly had been efforts to house workers prior to this. There were skid camps that were set up as sort of temporary seasonal housing for ephemeral logging activity. But these company towns are a much more permanent settlement and give employees the opportunity to maintain a more permanent residence and escape this sort of cycle of transience. And that this sort of offer isn't just being extended to what are considered the skilled positions such as bullwhacker or sawyer or saw filer, but rather that choppers, tree fellers, are being included in this, which is an interesting development. But as I should really explain, these developments are really across the board for the lumber industry. These aren't really targeting tree fellers at this point. And compared to other positions during this time, tree fellers are still pretty low on the totem pole as far as incremental increases in status. Probably the biggest victory for labor during this period would be in 1890, where the 10-hour day was earned for mill workers. Although, of course, this wasn't earned through unionization, but it was rather granted by local lumber baron William Carson of the Dolbear and Carson Mill. And other firms followed suit to sort of maintain the paternalistic image of lumber employers in Humboldt County. By 1904, the big three of Humboldt County were the Hammond Lumber Company, the Pacific Lumber Company, and the Northern Redwood Lumber Company, which had owned together 64% of the county's timberlands and accounted for almost 60% of their total milling capacity. Pacific and Northern Redwood reflected a heavily corporatist model, while Hammond was sort of a flagship hybrid of corporate and proprietary management. There will still many strong examples of proprietary capitalism in the county, as is the aforementioned Dolbear and Carson Mill was probably the biggest operator in that vein during this time. but the sort of conflict between these two models of management would really come to a head in the first decade of the 20th century. By 1900, the global building boom had stimulated Humboldt's economy and created a labor market that reinvigorated Eureka's unionization effort. By 1902, unions began to emerge based on occupation within the lumber industry, including a regional Humboldt Tree Fellers Union. Local labor historian Daniel Cornford has suggested this reflects a degree of sectional job consciousness among lumber workers. By 1903, about 1,000 lumber workers in Humboldt County belonged to a union of some variety. A lot of this is in part that there's a growing recognition that this outside corporate management is leading to a harsher regime because many workers are facing persistent wage cuts. So there would be a series of small strikes that are precipitating between 1902 and 1904, but the culminating event would be in 1905 when the Humboldt Lumber Manufacturers Association proposes a new board system. This board system would charge workers, whether they worked that day or not, 50 cents a day for room and board, whereas in the previous system where their wages had covered room and board, many workers had considered this previous system their birthright and were very upset about this. Many workers organized locally around the International Brotherhood of Woodsmen and Sawmill Workers, or the IBWSW, which organized their Humboldt County chapter the same year in 1905. They united across ethnic, racial, and political divides and were establishing union reps at every local logging camp. They eventually wielded their power by organizing a large union-wide strike in 1907 that would gain support from the outside through the industrial workers of the world, which were, if you're not familiar with them, are a socialist union that was actively seeking the overthrow of capitalism. So in this sort of conflict of proprietary and corporate models, we have a sort of third contender entering the fray of the Redwoods. And certainly socialism has a much longer history in Redwoods and Humboldt County, which is enough for a whole different talk. But as far as direct political action, IWW is probably the strongest example in Humboldt County's history, and is fair to say as a fair starting point for this sort of conflict that is brewing in the lumber industry. The Humboldt Lumber Manufacturers Association would certainly respond under the leadership of A.B. Hammond of the Hammond Lumber Company, forcing workers to sign yellow dog contracts, barring them from joining a union, evicting union workers from company housing, also beginning to hire large amounts of non-white workers from out of the area to replace the fired union workers, in this case bringing in many Italian laborers. But what's interesting is that the big three of Humboldt County that were generally practicing the corporate model were the most hard hit by this strike. The proprietary mills such as Elk River and Dolbeer and Carson were actually largely unaffected. They only really had a handful of laborers leave on strike during this time. And what's more interesting about that is that they were paying essentially the same wages, but workers were reporting a very qualitative difference in the nature of labor relations during this time. The ultimate efforts of the strike would only have marginal victories because these sort of wage increases and wage protections that they were fighting for would only be granted on an individual basis, and this would be granted on a basis of a new bonus system that was essentially hinged on workers meeting new quotas that were established by these lumber companies. And many workers became frustrated with this idea of the union being ineffective and tore up their union cards. The IBWSW would actually fold for good by 1911. Many would actually defect from the IWW as well. There would be efforts in the early 1910s of the IWW to continue these sort of strikes, but they were very limited in practicing and not nearly as widespread as the 1907 strike. But what is interesting in this context of having these really hyper-regional labor identities appearing and really hyper-regional associations with the logging industry popping up is also being reflected in the development of saw technology at this time, being reflected in the marketing of saws during this time. Because this coincides with a boom of varieties of saw patterns available, specifically the rise of Pacific Coast patterns in the early 20th century. The earliest of this marketing strategy, and these were saws that were marketed explicitly for the felling of the large trees of the Pacific Northwest. The earliest of this marketing strategy appears in 1904 with Simmons Manufacturing Company's debut of the Bay State pattern, marketed to California. Henry Diston would soon follow suit with an Oregon pattern the following year, and by 1906, E.C. Atkins & Co. would debut the Pacifico and Pacific Star patterns. This would expand by the 19-teens to start drift away from just being about larger trees, but to really hone in on really local logging communities. That by the 19-teens, E.C. Atkins and Company is debuting the Eureka, Redwood King, and Redwood Falling patterns, marketed to the Redwood country and the Humboldt Bay region, which actually constitute a large collection of the saws that we have at Fort Humboldt. And we know that this sort of marketing strategy was really successful for saw manufacture on this hyper-regional level, because all of the major saw manufacturers began doing this going forward, and there continued to be a large boom in saw patterns. And they certainly had the knowledge and infrastructure with their network of cross-cut demonstrators and marketing aficionados on the ground to sort of make these connections and understand these sort of complex developments that are happening in logging camps across the Humboldt Bay region. But as I mentioned before, proprietary capitalism had really showed its strength in the context of the labor unrest of the first decade of the 20th century. But how corporate capitalism chose to adapt to those issues would ultimately undermine proprietary capitalism. It would result in a new system of labor relations to replace corporate paternalism, generally referred to as welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism included an expansion of hospital and healthcare plans, as well as the development of social and recreational facilities in company towns to keep workers entertained and feeling that they're living a rich, fulfilling life. It certainly wasn't exclusively local. It had come with the rise of progressive politics associated with the Roosevelt administration, as well as then Governor of California, Hiram Johnson. It was emerging more as a conservative solution to facing a capitalism in crisis, as unions had become a problem across all American manufacturing industries. This would produce notable pieces of legislation, such as the California Working Men's Compensation Act and the Camp Sanitation Act of 1913. And this sort of serving as the government as a middleman between employer and employee in this context of labor relations now, disrupted the sort of informal relationship that proprietary capitalism's version of paternalism had really hinged on previously. And going forward, many of the proprietary mills would actually begin to lose many numbers of their workforce in the coming decades. And also, given their smaller size and the growing size of the corporate mills, they would be less adaptive to coming market downturns, especially in the context of the coming Great Depression. And many of these smaller proprietary mills would gradually fold, and corporate capitalism would certainly take over Redwood country. But certainly, as part of the Working Men's Compensation Act, Insurance and Safety Act of 1913, came the Industrial Safety Commission, which started publishing safety manuals across all trade industries in California, including logging and sawmill safety orders. originally published in 1916. And what these are, as far as understanding history of labor relations, are really a series of legal protections for workers in the lumber industry. And so we have very detailed instructions of day-to-day operations of workers in the railroads. We have very detailed instructions of workers using steam donkeys. We have very detailed instructions of workers in the sawmills. These have legally mandated codes, legally mandated language. But interestingly, this original 1916 version has no rules regarding general tree work. And in fact, it's not even until the third edition that there's any rule surrounding tree work is even implemented. And that first rule is that high climbers are required to be supplied with a safety harness when ascending a spar tree. And if you're not familiar with what that means, here is a picture of a guy doing that. And what this can be generally understood as, for the context of understanding the growth of the tree feller role and status at this point, is that there's still really no legal protections for tree fellers. They're still at a very low legal status and generally viewed as an unskilled position. But what is happening during this time, as I mentioned, there was the bonus system that came around with welfare capitalism to sort of incentivize workers to keep up with these new demands. And this, for tree fellers, could essentially make a certain tree feller an elite tree feller and become more sought after and gain sort of certain job securities in their workplace. And interestingly, at the same time that this bonus system appears, roughly mid-1900s to 19-teens, is the same time that the drag saw begins being used for tree felling in the redwoods. And if you're saying to yourself, well, what's a drag saw? You've reached a very exciting portion of the presentation, referred to as the age of the power saw. A drag saw is essentially a A-framed designed with a large engine and a mechanical arm that pulls a crosscut saw back and forth in a reciprocating pattern and is mounted on the tree with a series of hooks. The advantage of the drag saw, theoretically, was that it could make a tree felling operation reduced to one person. And I say theoretically because this meant that one person could lift this over 300-pound machine, mount it onto the tree, complete all of the felling techniques, and then mount it onto the back of the tree to complete the back cut and do it again. So, theoretically. And the original gas-powered drag saw would be invented at the Eureka Foundry in August 1886, but it was based on a portable steam-powered saw invented by A. Ransom of England. While chainsaws were being built lighter and more compact through the early 20th centuries, the drag saw was being viewed by many tree fellers in the redwoods as more rugged and simple and consequently more dependable in operation. Its sort of engine design was largely based off of early Model T cars and actually shared many similar parts with them, and would be popular in redwoods as parts of other parts of the country, largely due to the fact that chainsaws required a larger and larger engine to extend bar length. But essentially the same size drag saw engine could attach a longer and longer saw blade to accommodate for the wide diameter of old growth coast redwoods. And so for instance, the longest drag saw blade that we have in our Fort Humboldt collection is actually around 15 feet long. But as I've mentioned, the chainsaw is certainly also around. The cutting chain was originally patented by Harvey Brown of New York City in 1858, as pictured here on the left, but it never made it off the drawing board. It was originally a hand-powered design, but the first experiment with a motorized chainsaw actually also happened. The first chainsaw experiment on the Pacific coast and perhaps in the US as well also happened locally in Eureka, actually near Sequoia Park. While the inventor's name has been lost to history, two men bearing the names of Benz and Hendricks are associated with the event. It was driven by a two-cylinder water-cooled engine. The machine drew its fuel and water supply from tanks that were nailed to the tree trunk above it and removed when the tree was about to go over. So you can see, certainly not an easily replicable process. And it should be also mentioned that this early saw had actually no bar. Instead, it had a chain that wrapped around the circumference of the tree and cut inwards from all sides. But the first saw with a bar would also be local to the Humboldt Redwoods, invented in 1910 by R.L. Muir. His gas-powered endless crosscut saw, pictured here on the right, would actually make the cover of Scientific American, putting the Humboldt Redwoods on the cover of Scientific American. The saw reportedly cut through a log 5 to 7 feet thick in less than 10 minutes, but its gargantuan weight and size hindered its efficiency. So as the same article that sort of professes the scientific advances of this endless crosscut saw also claims that you would be, quote, better off with 2 Swedes and a bucksaw. And sort of part of the main advantage of a chainsaw during this time was the rotating cutting pattern, because it was deemed more efficient than the reciprocating cutting pattern of either a drag saw or the 2-person crosscut. And so there were other saws that were competing for that sort of technology at this time. Probably the most popular would be the Holt saw, which wouldn't be very popular locally, but would sort of have relative popularity in Russia and France during this time. It's pictured here on the left. It took the circular saw blades that were being used inside sawmills and tried to apply them to tree felling. But if you can't tell by the photo, it is remembered as dangerous and cumbersome. But the technology of the chainsaw would quickly take off to become portable. The first portable chainsaw would be patented by Charles Wolfe of Peninsula Iron Works in Portland, Oregon. It debuted in 70, 80, and 90-pound models and was powered by electricity. And by portable and electric powered, I mean you had a cable running from the saw to an on-site electric generator that you couldn't go too far from. And it wouldn't be very popular in the redwoods, largely because the bar length was very short, but would be used in other parts of the country. The cutting chain for this model is pretty unique also. As you can see here on the bottom, it's actually based off of Robert E. Poindexter's early patent for saws, showing that it has cutter teeth and raker teeth. But certainly the age of the power saw isn't something that everybody is excited about. Loggers aren't really busting down the door of Charles Wolfe. As historians David Lee and Ellis Lucia have argued, tree fellers had a lot of faith in the tradition of their craft and felt trepidation about the new skills these new machines would demand. In fact, they feared the adoption of the chainsaw would introduce a whole new approach to working in the woods, one that would soon make them obsolete. Additionally, the Pacific Northwest was very reluctant to adopting power saws because by 1920, they of course had been practicing clear cutting this whole time and had clear cut majority of the flat land and gently sloping land, so that the majority of the land remaining would be steep and sloping, and loggers were less willing to carry these sort of heavy machines uphill. Though part of the reason the drag saw would be popular locally is the redwoods, in comparison to the rest of the Pacific Northwest, are actually pretty gently sloping and would have wider space in between trees that would make transporting the drag saw a lot easier. But consequently, when it came to the Pacific Logging Congress, essentially the Pacific Coast-wide version of the Humboldt Lumber Manufacturers Association, did their pictorial machinery show in 1929. The number of hand-powered saws to power saws, hand saws outnumbered power saws 2-to-1, as you can see here. And this sort of emphasis on tradition associated with the handsaw is certainly reflected in the way drag saws are being marketed in these equipment catalogs. Unlike the two-person crosscut saw, which is taking up pages and pages and is showing every possible variety, the drag saw is limited often to like a half-page call to inquire offer. This is generally because the drag saw would really only be offered to those with enough capital to invest in it, which would generally be a large corporate logging firm. And it's also probably the notion that they don't want to alienate the sort of independent, smaller logger operations that are still a large base of these saw manufacturers' clientele. But what's really puzzling about the blades of drag saws is that it's essentially the same technology as a two-person crosscut saw. They have different mounts, but essentially if you put two handles on a drag saw blade, it would function like a two-person crosscut saw. So as I mentioned earlier, there's all this emphasis on hyper-regional patterns for two-person crosscut saws. But drag saws are being marketed with the older patterns. They're being marketed with very broadly used patterns such as lance tooth or champion tooth. And this really speaks to the notion of what the power saw is trying to accomplish. And what the power saw is trying to accomplish is regional consolidation. And so you might recall that other major manufacturing industries in the United States by the turn of the century, such as oil and steel, had been monopolized. The lumber industry in the US was never monopolized. And the reason for this is because different kinds of trees required different milling technology. And what this speaks to is an effort to sort of standardize technology in the effort for regional consolidation. And therefore, this idea of the power saw being too expensive for smaller lumber operators, and also this emphasis on regional consolidation, means that the growth of the power saw is inherently intertwined with the growth of corporate capitalism in the Redwoods. Then by the 1930s, Charles Wolfe's company, the Wolfe Saw, began manufacturing, shifting away from electricity to gasoline power. And this shift was largely inspired by the influence of German manufacturers such as Stihl and Dolmar that became very successful with exporting gas-powered chainsaws to the Pacific Northwest, which were much lighter and more portable. For instance, they had a 46-pound chainsaw that actually caught the eye of the depression-ridden lumber industry as a sort of hope to pull us out of that industry. However, 1930s became suddenly more complicated with the outbreak of World War II. It would spark a nationwide mobilization to improve lumber harvesting to keep up with the demands for construction. This necessitated the mechanization of the felling process, which would in turn influence further investment in that process. However, with the ignition of World War II, steel quickly lost patent protection on its saws, and Germany's international trade quickly restricted. Since 1938, off-brand copies of Stihl's chainsaws began to appear across the planet. This, in the United States, is really no coincidence. The U.S. Forest Service developed an equipment development laboratory in Portland with a vigorous promotion of copies of the Stihl saw. They recruited manufacturers such as Henry Diston, Titan, based out of Seattle, as well as IEL. If you're not familiar with them, you'll probably know them by their current brands, which are Pioneer and Homelight. These produced large two-person chainsaws that were around 8 feet long. The pulley had stinger on the chain. Sorry, can I do this over here? Yeah. So the, oh man. So the U.S. Forest Service developed an equipment laboratory out of Portland, Oregon to vigorously promote copies of the Stihl saw. They recruited manufacturers such as Henry Diston, as well as Titan, based out of Seattle, and IEL. If you're not familiar with IEL, you probably know them by their current brands, which are Pioneer and Homelight. These chainsaws would be large two-person models. The division of labor here they would generally have a younger faller on the machine end to sort of carry the weight, where they would have an experienced tree faller on an end with a handle with known as the stinger. Would sort of skillfully guide the bar through the trunk of the tree. But these chainsaws were limited to around 8 feet in length, which was still not fully practical for many of the old growth coast redwoods. There was a technique used known as side notching, but this was largely dismissed by loggers as time consuming and inefficient, especially since the chainsaw had a high likelihood of getting stuck in the tree. Consequently, many loggers in the redwoods were still relying on the drag saw. And while the drag saw wouldn't have the same federal investment during this time, it would greatly expand in technology. The sort of race for the drag saw at this point would be who could build a lighter and lighter drag saw, because as you can remember, the early drag saws, both the drag saw that would be on the market by 1935 would be the Wade, RM Wade & Co. drag saw produced out of Portland, which was over 300 pounds. This would be quickly bested by the Vaughn saw, produced by Harsh Machine Works, also out of Portland, weighing 225 pounds. And then there would be some local manufacturers, such as Hanson Machine Works out of Eureka, that produced the Hanson Pony by 1940, which we have an engine of there in the middle that weighed around 150 pounds. And by 1944, Cliff Merrill and a certain Mr. Barnwell of Eureka would put on the market a 95-pound air-cooled drag saw called the Little Woodsman, which was designed with Cliff Merrill in mind because he was a self-professed little man and wanted a saw that he himself could handle. And by 1949, Merrill had made and sold over 2,500 of them locally, making them very popular. The increasing power of state-of-the-art drag saws and chainsaws had enabled the cutting of wider diameter trees. And essentially, since only the largest companies had the capital to continuously invest in new technologies and manipulate legislation through institutions such as the California Board of Forestry, companies used this to their advantage to pass a minimum diameter law in 1943, which outlawed the harvesting of trees smaller than 18 inches in diameter. Large logging corporations wielded this position to further consolidate control of redwood country, wielding a sort of environmental ethos, favoring now a sort of selective harvesting to replace the previous strategy of clear cutting. This would be sort of a death knell for the legendary Jippo logger of the redwoods. That was the sort of independent operator. This would also be facilitated through the use of Caterpillar tractors and diesel trucks, which had gained popularity and sort of usurped the position of railroads and steam donkeys in the redwoods by this point. And then by the 1930s, 1935 really, as part of the New Deal, the National Labor Relations Act would finally recognize the right of workers to engage in union organizing and collective bargaining. Locally, in May 1935, the Lumber and Sawmill Workers Union, an arm of the American Federation of Labor, would successfully vote to strike for higher wages and fewer hours, earning several successes locally, making actually the Hammond Lumber Company a union shop for the first time ever, now under the leadership of his son Leonard C. Hammond, who would actually be remembered for really expanding many institutions of welfare capitalism locally in the Humboldt Bay Redwoods. And speaking of expansions of welfare capitalism, by 1937, we finally have the 5th edition of the logging and sawmill safety orders, and we finally have our general tree work section referred to as the felling, limbing, bucking, and peeling section that has extensive protections now for tree fellers, and now recognize it as a protected position. During this time, with the advent of power saws, we're actually starting to see wider hiring of tree fellers during this point. Actually, the fear that many had felt earlier had been sort of quelled in that lumber companies actually brought up their numbers so they could easily consolidate the region. And consequently, it started to be treated more as a skilled labor position. Following World War II, there would continue to be advances in saw technology by the companies that had filled the vacuum left behind by the German manufacturers. A couple notable examples from the Fort Humboldt collection would be the Diston DA211 and the Titan Blue Streak. Diston DA211 had an engine designed by Mercury Kiekhaefer. If you're not familiar with them, they're better known for building the engines on speedboats. This would be probably one of the most powerful chainsaws of its era. Very, very impressive piece of machinery. The Titan Blue Streak would be notable locally because Titan actually noticed the gap in marketing that they had, that the Redwoods represented to them. And so they built a prototype version of the Blue Streak chainsaw designed for felling old growth coast redwoods. It had a 22-foot long bar and it had dual machines, one on each end. And this thing was crazy powerful. And if they built more than one and actually sold them to market, there probably would be a lot fewer coast redwoods today. But the sort of golden age of chainsaw production would be into the 50s and 60s. And by the end of this period, all of the basic features of the modern chainsaw would be in place. There would be part of the World War II sort of production hub sponsored by the Forest Service. IEL produced the Beaver, which was the first one-man chainsaw, which had a pretty short bar and not terribly much power. But IEL would continue to expand on this idea of the one-man chainsaw. And 1951, they invented a sort of direct drive model with the Model HA that could handle up to a 32-inch bar. The sort of difference here was that the reason why chainsaws were so big and heavy previously is that they had these really bulky gearboxes, and you essentially had to shift up to get to the right cutting speed. And this increased the weight and drag of the saw. And so the logic was to reduce the size of cutting teeth and shorten bar length to reduce drag, and this was very successful. That by 1956, they would produce a Model JA with a 50-inch bar with the same technology that could now be used to fell trees up to 100 inches in diameter. And consequently, with this invention, the one-man chainsaw could now be feasibly used practically for many cases in redwood felling. So essentially the technology of the one-man chainsaw would take off pretty quickly. Many manufacturers would quickly pivot from the two-man chainsaw to focusing on improving the one-man chainsaw with longer bar length. Such as the Little Woodsman Company, as you remember previously manufacturing drag saws, that we have an example of their chainsaw in the upper left corner. We have a McCulloch Motors Corporation, we have a Mahl, and we have another sort of more powerful version of the IEL that came later. But consequently, with this sort of streamlining of the felling process and reduced competition, there would actually be a decline in the workforce over the coming decades. And sort of the job security that many had come to find in the context of the expanding technology of tree felling had really hit its breaking point with the one-man chainsaw. And sort of the fears of the early pioneer loggers regarding power saws had started to come true to a certain extent. In addition to this sort of reduced competition, the sort of transition towards selective harvesting would also go away. Despite the technological advantages that had enabled it, logging companies were resuming clear cutting by the mid-1950s since they had legal and economic protection. The profound expansion of clear cutting by corporations with economic and legal shielding would spark immediate protests by the Sierra Club that would gradually escalate into the timber wars over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Although, as historian Darren Spees argues, the fundamental structure of governance of the logging industry handed down from the Progressive and New Deal era had remained fundamentally unchanged despite significant legislation at the federal level. And so we have seen tree felling influence changes in relationship with the environment. We have seen tree felling technology change with evolutions in labor relations. We have seen tree felling technology change with relations to job security for tree fellers. The role of tree felling technology is inextricably tied to the growth of the logging industry and is detrimental to really understanding its trajectory through this period. And certainly while this brings me to the end of my presentation, this doesn't bring me to the end of my research. Certainly the next topic I would really like to explore would be the advent of the feller buncher, which would be a large topic of the timber wars moving forward. Many will know. A big hurdle for my research previously has been that there isn't a bulk of oral histories specifically regarding the history of the saw and people's relationship with the saw. So if there's anybody out there that would like to talk to me about the feller buncher and its significance to the Humboldt Redwoods and the Bay region, please reach out to me. My email is pdo3@humboldt.edu. I would love to talk to you. As far as that goes, I'd like to thank Greg Collins at California State Parks for making this possible, Breezy Atkinson for her support, and Joshua Novakowski for their support for this project. I'd like to thank my then student assistant, now graduate, Qasim Naqvi, and thank you to Clark Museum and Humboldt Historical Society for sponsoring this talk. Thank you.